The first time my sister called me the family failure, she said it while adjusting my mother's pearl earrings in the hallway mirror. That detail matters. Not because of the pearls, because of how calm she was. People imagine family cruelty as shouting, as slammed doors, as the sort of noise that leaves witnesses. But the ugliest sentences in my family were always delivered while someone was doing something graceful. Fixing lipstick, folding napkins, smoothing tablecloth corners, passing deviled eggs at Easter with a smile that made outsiders think we were the kind of women who still wrote thank you notes by hand. My name is Lauren Whitaker. The woman in the mirror that night, 23 years old. Beautifully dressed for our cousin's rehearsal dinner, and already fluent in the kind of polished contempt rich families call honesty, was my older sister, Nathalie. And when she looked at me 19, pregnant, swollen-eyed from crying in the guest bathroom 10 minutes earlier, and said, "You do understand you're basically the cautionary tale now, right?" She wasn't saying something new. She was saying out loud what the rest of my family had already decided. If this story reaches into something real in you, subscribe now. Some families don't disown you. They do something quieter. They keep you close enough to shame publicly and far enough to deny they ever stopped loving you. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a pale blue house with white columns, a circular driveway, and the kind of porch people photograph in spring because bougainvillea and money do excellent work together when nobody mentions what's happening inside the rooms. My father, Martin, ran a regional commercial real estate firm and spent most of my childhood smelling faintly of aftershave, leather seats, and the inside of cold office buildings. My mother, Celeste, belonged to 3 committees, 2 boards, 1 Episcopal Church, and the quiet aristocracy of women who know exactly how to destroy a girl without ever needing to raise their voices. Then there was Natalie, 18 months older than me. Same coloring, different weather. She had my mother's taste, my father's appetite for status, and the early social intelligence that lets one daughter become the family's polished answer to every room before either child is old enough to understand what that costs the other. Natalie was not prettier than me. That's important. She was presented earlier. That is a different advantage, and sometimes the more decisive one. By the time we were 10 and 11, adults were already describing us in paired language that sounded harmless unless you knew how to hear it. Natalie is poised. Lauren is sweet. Natalie has such presence. Lauren is so warm. Natalie can really command a room. Lauren will make someone such a lovely wife one day. I learned young that in my family, daughters were not measured only for who they were. We were allocated. 1 for display, 1 for softness, 1 to inherit social architecture, 1 to make sure nobody called us cold. If I sound too precise about this, understand that precision is what happens when a girl spends enough years being explained to herself by other people. I was not stupid, not rebellious, not drifting. I got good grades, sang in school choir, babysat, helped with church drives, volunteered at a literacy nonprofit one summer, and discovered I loved event logistics because I liked making chaos useful. But none of my gifts looked expensive enough to my parents. They read as pleasant, assistive, marriageable, Natalie's gifts. By contrast, were narrated as strategic, elegant, leadership-coded, worth investing in. When she wanted a competitive private college up north, My father funded campus tours, application consultant, and test prep without blinking. When I suggested a program in hospitality management and event operations in Atlanta because I was fascinated by venue planning, people management, and the invisible systems underneath beautiful experiences, my mother smiled and said, "That could be very nice while you're young." While I was young, as if my interests were just decorative holding patterns until my real assignment arrived. I did not explode over any of that because girls raised like me do not start by resisting. We start by interpreting. Maybe they don't mean it like that. Maybe next year it'll feel different. Maybe if I become exceptional enough in the category they've assigned me, they'll realize I could have been trusted with a bigger one. That is how daughters stay too long inside other people's blueprints. Then I met Owen. And yes, before I go farther, I'm naming him because too many stories flatten men into either rescuer or ruin, and the truth is usually both less flattering and more human than that. Owen Barrett was 22 when I met him. Tall, clean-shaven, funny in a soft way. Worked weekends at a sailing company. While finishing an environmental design degree he spoke about like it mattered and also like it might never pay rent. Which should have told me something. He had beautiful hands, terrible money instincts, and the kind of attention that makes a 19-year-old girl from a cold family feel visible enough to confuse being seen with being safe. We met at a fundraiser setup. Of course we did. I was helping coordinate check-in tables and floral placement for a charity gala my mother had volunteered me into because event work was one of those areas where my competence could be used publicly without threatening the family. Hierarchy. Owen was there with a student design group helping with a temporary installation wall because somebody on the board believed young creative men made charity feel fresh. He flirted with me over extension cords and rental linens. We kissed 2 weeks later in his truck after bad tacos and a rainstorm. By then, I was already doing what daughters in my position always do. Not falling in love first. Falling into relief. Relief that someone liked me without comparison. Relief that a room with a man in it did not automatically contain Natalie winning and me being interpreted. My family disliked him immediately. Not because he was cruel, because he was insufficiently polished. He came from less money, had student debt, wore shirts. My mother would have called too casual for dinner. My father once asked him what his 5-year income picture looked like over cocktails in the den, as if dating me required a business prospectus. Owen laughed it off. I should have noticed then how much of his charm depended on not feeling the full cost of rooms other people had to survive more carefully. Still, we stayed together. Too long. Probably. Long enough for me to confuse his warmth with adulthood and his optimism with character. When I got pregnant, I was 19, and in the middle of my second year. The test sat on the bathroom counter, like a threat translated into plastic. I remember the exact room. College apartment. Peeling paint near the vent. The smell of cheap citrus hand soap and my roommate's conditioner. The hum of old plumbing in the wall. I remember looking at the result and not thinking no. Not at first. First came the body, knowing what the rest of me was still too frightened to name. Then came Owen. Then came the family. Owen cried. That part still surprises people when I tell it. As if men with bad futures can't have sincere feelings in the present. He cried. Held my hands. Said we'd figure it out. Said he loved me. Said maybe this wasn't what we planned, but maybe plans weren't everything. Then 2 weeks passed. Then money entered the room. Then his parents entered the room. Then the language shifted from we to what makes sense, and from love to timing, and from timing to your family's going to lose their minds. By the end of the month, Owen had not exactly left. He had just become less available every day, in a way that still let him feel like a good person. That's often how men like him go. Not with clear betrayal. With attrition. Enough tenderness to remain sympathetic. Not enough substance to stay. My mother found out from a pharmacy receipt. That detail would be funny if it weren't so perfect. I had gone home for a weekend and hidden prenatal vitamins in my toiletry bag under a curling iron and 2 blouses. She was looking for a backup steamer because we had a wedding-related event that night, and apparently in my family, privacy had always been one of those luxuries. People with less impressive houses were assumed to require more than we did. She came into my bedroom holding the vitamins between 2 fingers, the way women hold damp tissue when they don't want their hands implicated in the mess. "What is this?" I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, my pulse gone stupid. The room smelling like pressed linen and expensive soap, and the hydrangeas somebody had cut fresh for the upstairs hall table. And because there are moments when lying only extends the humiliation without changing the verdict, I said, "I'm pregnant." Silence. Then a sound from my mother I had never heard before, and have still never found a cleaner word for than disgust. Not panic. Not fear. Disgust. As if my body had not become vulnerable but vulgar. She sat down very slowly in the armchair near the window, still holding the bottle, and said, "No." It wasn't denial. It was refusal. As if she believed reality itself might still understand its manners and back out of the room. My father came up 10 minutes later. My mother had called him with the sort of efficiency she usually reserved for catering changes and death notices. He stood in the doorway, looked at my face once, and knew. Men like my father are never as unaware as people excuse them for being. They simply prefer moral delay when somebody else's shame can still be arranged into manageable proportions. "Is it true?" he asked. "Yes." Then came the family meeting. Of course it did. My parents never experienced crisis privately, if it could be converted into process. Natalie drove over that evening still in work clothes from the marketing firm, where she had already begun building the kind of glossy urban career my parents could dine out on. She came in carrying a leather tote, hugged my mother first, and then looked at me with the expression, "Women reserved for spills on borrowed silk." The living room smelled like bourbon, lilies, and air conditioning fighting summer. I sat on the sofa. My father took the armchair. My mother stood by the mantel like a plaintiff. Natalie perched on the edge of the chaise and crossed her legs with that same easy elegance people mistake for self-control when they have never been its target. My father asked where Owen was. I said not here. That answer alone told him enough to make his mouth harden. My mother asked if I understood what this would do to the family. Notice that. Not to me. To the family. As if my body had become a press release, I said, "I understand what it does to me." Natalie made the tiniest sound. Half laugh. Half sigh. The kind older sisters make when they think the younger one is still trying to make a moral event about her feelings instead of the optics. Then she said, "Lorraine, please don't start acting like the victim in a situation you created." That was the beginning. Not of the pregnancy. Of my official reassignment inside the family. No longer daughter with potential. No longer softer sister. I had become liability. My father's first impulse was solutions. Doctors. Options. Travel. Discretion. He never used the word abortion directly because families like mine prefer cruelty wrapped in euphemism, when the alternative would make the father's own conscience harder to style later. My mother said we needed to think long-term. Natalie said we needed to be realistic. The whole room filled with practical language, trying to outrun the fact that nobody in it was asking what I wanted, unless what I wanted happened to reduce the embarrassment. I said no. Ohms. Then again. Then more clearly. No. I wasn't ending the pregnancy. No. I wasn't leaving the state in secret. No. I wasn't pretending it had happened to somebody else. My mother went cold in a way, only she could. Then understand this, she said. If you insist on ruining your life, I don't expect us to act like it was done to you. That line would have been enough. But Natalie always needed to make the sentence cleaner. That was her gift. Her vice. Her role. Later that week, at our cousin's rehearsal dinner, she caught me alone in the upstairs hallway outside the guest bathroom. She was adjusting my mother's pearl earrings in the mirror when she looked at me and said, almost conversationally, "You do understand you're basically the cautionary tale now, right?" I just stared at her. She kept going. "You had everything. Education, family support, options, and you still chose this. Every younger girl in this family is going to hear your name now, when somebody wants to explain consequences." I remember the smell of powder and roses in that hallway, the laughter downstairs, the clink of glasses, my own face in the mirror looking younger than 19 had any right to. And then she said the sentence that branded itself into me. "You're the family failure now. Lorraine, you should at least have the dignity not to make everyone carry it for you." That was the moment I stopped asking whether I had misunderstood the room. You cannot misinterpret a blade once it is held still enough under the light. The months after that were a blur of humiliation disguised as structure. I withdrew from school for a year, because morning sickness and shame make terrible lab partners. My parents agreed to let me stay at home, but only under the sort of conditional support that makes help feel like supervised moral debt. My mother controlled every appointment she knew about. My father spoke to me in the tone men use with people whose choices they now believe have reduced their intelligence permanently. Natalie visited just enough to retain witness status in the family story, while never once making me feel less alone. Owen drifted all the way out by month 5. A text. Then a call. Then language about not being ready to be a father and wanting to avoid making things worse. He cried again. Men like him often do. Tears are cheap when responsibility is still optional. My son, Eli, was born on a wet March morning while magnolia trees outside the hospital windows looked absurdly alive for the kind of day I was having. Labor is too physical to be dignified and too consequential to be described honestly by anyone who uses the phrase miracle too casually. I remember the smell of sweat, antiseptic, blood, plastic tubing, and bad hospital coffee. I remember pain. I remember fear. I remember looking at him afterward red, furious, perfect. Mine, and feeling something split open that was not weakness and not joy exactly, but allegiance. That was when the real fight started. Not with my family. With gravity. With money. With childcare. With sleep. With every structural cruelty America reserves for young mothers and then blames them for not transcending attractively. My parents did help. Technically. A room in the house for another year. Health coverage through my father until I aged out. A stroller my mother described as practical enough not to look aspirational. Everything they gave came wrapped in a reminder that I was now living a smaller version of the life that had once been available to me if I had behaved more intelligently. Natalie got promoted. I got diapers. Natalie got wine nights and engagement rumors and business class client travel. I got pediatric fevers, cracked nipples, and the exact kind of exhaustion wealthy women write essays about only after they've survived it with money. But here's what my family didn't account for. I was still good at systems, still good at events, still good at making things work under pressure. Motherhood did not erase those skills. It sharpened them until they became steel. I started small. Local church functions for money. Baby showers. Fundraising brunches. Then vendor coordination for a friend of a friend who ran a small venue and needed someone who could solve problems without melting in public. Then another referral. Then a corporate luncheon. Then wedding logistics. Then weekend planning contracts. Then an assistant. Then a second venue client. Then my own LLC registered online at 1:14 a.m. with Eli asleep in a bassinet beside my desk and a bottle of formula going cold because I'd forgotten it was there. No one in my family saw that coming. Not because I was secretly extraordinary. Because they had never understood that the same daughter they'd dismissed as too soft for medicine had always been made for pressure, if the pressure served something she chose herself. I started small. That is how most women rebuild after public humiliation. Not with one grand comeback speech. With invoices. With text confirmations. With folding chairs at midnight and knowing which florist lies about delivery times and which rental company will still answer if the linen order goes wrong at 6:40 a.m. on a Saturday. Eli was 6 months old, the first time I coordinated a full event myself. A church fundraising brunch. Not glamorous. 47 women in pastel dresses. One pastor who kept changing the order of remarks. 2 volunteer servers who thought running out of coffee somehow made the event more intimate. And a dessert table held together mostly by tape. Prayers. And my refusal to let the room fall apart in public. I made $400. Came home smelling like coffee grounds. Roses. And stress. Stood in the kitchen with my shoes still on. Looked at the check in my hand. And cried. Not because it was a lot. Because it was mine. That was the beginning. 1 event became 3. 3 became a wedding assistant contract. Then corporate luncheons. Then silent auctions. Then charity dinners. Then venue consulting. Then somebody's cousin's engagement party for a family who had more money than manners, and exactly the kind of drama no one wants to admit they're willing to pay to be managed discreetly. I was very good at it. Not because I loved decor in some soft-focus feminine way. I loved flow. Pressure. Timing. Human behavior under status conditions. I understood who needed flattering and who needed redirecting. I could sense a late caterer the way other people sense weather. I knew how to save a room before the host realized it was at risk. And rich people will pay absurdly well for anyone who can prevent embarrassment while making it look effortless. That is an entire industry. By the way, and once I realized that, the work changed in my body from temporary survival to architecture. By the time Eli was 3, I was not just taking jobs. I was running operations. Part planner. Part fixer. Part social engineer with a clipboard. I had 2 contract assistants. 1 old SUV full of emergency supplies. A website I built myself after midnight over 3 weekends. And enough repeat clients to understand that I had accidentally become the sort of woman my mother might have admired if she had not first needed me to fail more visibly. She did admire it later. Of course, but not cleanly. Families like mine do not pivot into pride. They perform gradual revision. At first, my mother called it, "Your little business." Then, "Lauren's event thing." Then, "Lauren's company." By the time Eli was in kindergarten and I had staff, a studio office, and 3 venue partnerships, she was telling people I had always had such a gift for making beauty happen. Beauty. That word nearly made me laugh every time. Because what I actually had a gift for was preventing upper-middle-class emotional collapse behind floral walls. But mothers like mine can only recognize female power once they've translated it back into something decorative. Natalie married late enough for the family to begin worrying privately, and gracefully enough for nobody to say so where she could hear it. Her career climbed. Her wardrobe improved. Her apartment got bigger. She dated men with the kind of names that sounded expensive in my mother's mouth. But there was always, beneath all that polish, a tiny vibration of urgency. Because women like Natalie survive on social ranking, and there is no ranking more dangerous than aging in beautiful rooms before the right ring arrives. So when she finally got engaged at 32 to a venture capital man named Preston, who looked like old money, had gone to law school, and come back slightly more moisturizing, my family reacted like a monarchy had been restored. My mother cried. My father opened bourbon. Aunt Nora sent flowers. Connor, who by then had become the family's only functional human in the ordinary sense, texted me, "Brace yourself. This is going to become a national holiday." He was right. The engagement party was not just a party. It was an event. Which, in my family, meant theater. My mother wanted old Charleston elegance without obvious effort. Natalie wanted status without sentimentality. Preston wanted something tasteful in the dangerous tone men use when they plan to contribute no real labor but still expect the atmosphere to flatter their restraint. And because the city's best venues were already booked deep into the season, because timing and social ambition make very poor roommates, and because my mother's event committee world had spent years quietly consuming my work while pretending not to notice how much they depended on it, one of her friends suggested the one solution no one in my family had expected to become necessary. Me. Not me as daughter. Me as operator. By then, Whitaker Event Works had become the kind of firm people called when the guest list mattered. The host was difficult, and discretion was not optional. My mother did not call me directly at first. Of course she didn't. She sent Nora. Families like mine love emissaries because emissaries provide the dignity of plausible hesitation. Aunt Nora arrived one Tuesday with lemon loaf and the kind of smile women wear when they know they are carrying a proposition that will either heal a room or expose it. We sat in my office. The studio smelled like printer ink, eucalyptus stems, and the lavender hand cream one of my assistants used too generously. Eli was in after-school care. My calendar was obscene. 3 weddings. 1 non-profit gala. A launch dinner. And enough emails flagged urgent to make anyone with a weaker nervous system start lying down on the floor professionally. Nora folded her hands and said, "Your mother is in a bit of a bind." That sentence nearly made me laugh. Not because it was untrue, because in my family, my mother's inconvenience had always been treated like weather, and my devastation had always been treated like consequences. A bind? The venue she wanted fell through. Nathalie is particular, and everyone says you're the best. There it was. everyone says. Translation. Reality has become too expensive to continue pretending your skill set is merely charming. I said nothing. Nora went on. Your mother wants to know whether you'd consider taking over the planning. There are moments when old versions of yourself arrive all at once. Nineten, pregnant, crying in the upstairs bathroom while Natalie adjusted pearls and assigned me the role of cautionary tale. 22. Rocking Eli at 3 a.m. while pricing napkin rentals for rich women who would have crossed the street to avoid my family story if they'd known it. 26. Building floral mock-ups on a folding table in a studio with peeling paint and a landlord who thought women in service businesses should smile more when asking about maintenance. And now this. My family asking me to build the room they wanted Natalie seen in topless. That is the problem with success. By the way, it eventually becomes useful to the very people who once preferred your humiliation. I asked. Does Natalie know she's asking me? Nora hesitated. That told me enough. Then she isn't, I said. Nora looked embarrassed. She knows your mother is exploring options. Option. Again. Families like mine always use business language when they want to avoid naming hierarchy. I leaned back in my chair and thought of Eli's tuition account. Payroll. A possible second location. And the very practical reality that revenge stories become less cinematic and much more interesting once they intersect with contract law. Then I said, I'm available for a consultation if she wants to be my client. Nora stared at me, then smiled slowly. There it is. That smile said, the girl they thought would spend her life asking to be let back in has turned out to own the door. The consultation happened 3 days later. At my office. Not the family house. Not my mother's dining room. Not Natalie's apartment. Mine. That mattered. Control begins with geography. Natalie arrived first. Cream blouse. Camel heels. Hair perfect. Expression neutral enough to suggest this was all mildly ironic and not. In fact, one of the most humiliating errands of her adult life. My mother came with her, which told me immediately Natalie did not intend to enter the room as a client, but as a daughter with inherited rank and hoped maternal presence would preserve the old architecture. They sat across from me at the glass conference table, while my associate brought coffee and mood boards to the side. Credenza. The room looked very good. That mattered more than I let either of them see. Women like my mother and sister only understand female authority once it is expensive enough to have visible surfaces. I opened my notebook and said, tell me what the event needs to do. Natalie blinked. Not what she wanted. What the event needed to do. Important distinction. She recovered quickly and launched into her preferred atmosphere, intimate but elevated. Southern but not cliché. Romantic but not soft. Old Charleston, but cleaner. Guest list, just under 100. No visible budget conversation. And absolutely no young mother entrepreneur touches anywhere in the execution. Yes, she actually said that. Not directly. She said, I really don't want it to feel crafty or overly sentimental. Then looked at me as if the sentence were professionally neutral. My mother shifted in her chair. She had heard it too. But mothers like mine do not challenge cruelty when it travels in the old family dialect. They simply wait to see if the target still speaks it fluently enough to bleed on schedule. I smiled. Understood. I said, and made a note. Not because I was hurt. Because useful contempt should always be documented when someone else is paying the invoice. We discussed floral range, lighting, invitation pacing, valet flow, alcohol service, weather contingencies, accessibility for Preston's grandmother, and a venue hold I happen to control through a standing relationship with one of the most desirable waterfront properties in the city. That last part changed everything. Natalie had assumed I was one vendor among many. My mother had assumed I would be a fixer they could still emotionally outrank while benefiting from current market realities. Neither had understood that my company now controlled access in the exact arena where their social performance needed the most protection. When I mentioned the waterfront property, Natalie leaned forward. "You can get us that venue?" I met her eyes. "I can lock it by end of day if I choose to." That sentence landed exactly where it needed to. There are moments when your sibling finally sees your success not as personality, not as recovery, not as feminine resilience in a magazine profile sense, but as hard leverage. This was one of them. My mother glanced at me in a way I had never seen before. Not guilt, not pride. Assessment adjusted by evidence. By the end of the meeting, Natalie agreed to the planning package. My mother offered to help with whatever family details mattered most, which in translation meant she wanted influence without contract accountability. I said all family communication regarding the event had to come through one point of contact only. "Which is?" my mother asked. "Me," I said. That was the first formal humiliation. Necessary. Not cruel. Necessary. The next 6 weeks were glorious in the cold administrative way only certain kinds of revenge ever are. Signed proposal. Paid deposit. Venue lock. Catering design. Lighting. Strings. Stationary flow. Rain backup. Power coverage. Table geometry. Musicians. Parking logistics. My company did what it always did under pressure, performed beautifully. Natalie tried several times to reassert old hierarchy through tone. Little comments. "Can we make sure this doesn't feel too commercial? I know this is a big event for your company. I assume we can still be flexible because we're family." That last one almost made me laugh in her face. Almost. Instead, I said, "We're flexible inside contract terms." That was when she started understanding there would be no emotional discount. Good. There shouldn't have been. My father got involved only once, and even that was revealing. He called to ask whether there was any room to be sensible on one of the line items because the floral budget looked ambitious. I stood in my warehouse studio under hanging greenery samples and replied, "You paid 5 times this much to help Simon get through one board review program." Silence. "Then, that's not the same." "No." I said, "This has invoices." He never called about budget again. The engagement party took place in late spring. Warm evening. Salt in the air. Waterfront light hitting glassware and polished brass just hard enough to make everybody look better than they were. The venue was stunning. Not because venues save bad families. Because I know exactly how to build a room that flatters everyone in it and tells the truth to exactly one person. The floral installations rose clean and elegant from the corners without screaming for attention. Candlelight was softened just enough for photographs and vanity. The string quartet knew when to disappear sonically. The service staff moved like expensive ghosts. The champagne stayed cold. The room looked like Natalie's fantasy had been realized by someone with actual command of logistics. Which, of course, it had. I did not arrive early. That mattered. I had been there all day through staff. Floor plans. Load in. Timing. Final walkthrough. And emergency fixes. But for the social arrival, I came at the correct moment. In a navy silk dress. Hair controlled. Shoulders calm. Carrying none of the body language my family had once associated with me when they needed me easier to rank. Ele, who was 9 by then, and sharp enough to understand family weather, even when I tried to build umbrellas around him. I stayed home with Noah and ordered pizza while sending me texts about whether rich people really ate tiny crab cakes for fun. As he entered, one of the event leads murmured, "Everything's smooth. Brideside is nervous but manageable." Brideside. I almost smiled. Not sister. Brideside. Even language had begun reclassifying them outside the old family map. Natalie saw me first. From across the room, near the champagne tower and the floral stair installation, she went still. And because I know what you care about. Yes, this is the freeze from the title. But it did not come from my dress, or from my confidence, or from some melodramatic reveal. It came from context. From seeing me not as tolerated sister, not as cautionary tale, not as the young mother who had salvaged something respectable from a ruined start. She saw me as the woman the venue manager deferred to, the woman the catering captain checked with, the woman whose event it actually was in all the operational ways that matter when status is on display. She froze because the room had already chosen its axis before she finished walking into it. My mother saw it too. Then my father. And all three of them had to stand there for one clean second under candlelight and live inside the fact that the family failure had not merely survived. She had built the architecture they now needed to be seen inside. Natalie walked toward me with a smile that might have passed at 10 feet for poise and at 3 feet for strain. "Lauren," she said. Just my name. No hug. Too many witnesses. "Good. You look beautiful," I said. That was true. And also strategic. Nothing destabilizes cruel women more than being met with professionalism when they expected either supplication or pettiness. She glanced around once, then leaned in slightly and said, "I didn't realize you were actually funding part of this." There it was. The second reveal. Because yes, beyond the planning fee, I had quietly covered the venue upgrade gap when one of Preston's venture capital friends had overpromised and disappeared. And because my mother had let the family budget assumption get too aggressive before reality showed up with numbers. Not for free. Nothing this late in my life is free. But yes, I covered it. Not because Natalie deserved rescue. Because controlling the venue meant controlling the room. And because some opportunities come dressed as invoices, I held her gaze and said, "I know." That was all. No speech. No morale lecture. Just a sentence small enough to make her hear everything inside it. My mother reached us then. All pearls and chilled panic under social varnish. "We are so grateful," she said quickly, in the tone women use when they want to frame the room before anyone else can. No, there it was again. Trying to move from judgment to gratitude without crossing truth. I turned to her. And because the quartet had shifted softer, and because waiters were gliding past, and because my father was close enough now to hear every word, but not close enough to rescue anybody with tone. I said it plainly. You called me the consequence? I said to Natalie. She blinked. My mother stiffened. My father stopped moving. I continued. Tonight you're standing inside something I built. No raised voice. No tremor. No public breakdown. That is why it worked. Because calm truth in a beautiful room is harder to dismiss than anger. Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it. Then said the only thing women like her ever say when reality corners them more elegantly than they're prepared for. That's not fair. I smiled. A very small smile. Yes. I said, exactly. That was the end of it. Not the event. The family geometry. The rest of the evening still happened. Toasts. Laughter. Ring photos. Old Charleston money pretending it had invented candlelight. But underneath it all, the hierarchy was gone. Not emotionally. Structurally. My father found me near the back service corridor half an hour later, while I was checking with the venue manager on dessert timing. He looked older than he had that morning. Not frail. Just finally accurate. I didn't know. He said, there are so many things fathers mean by that line. I didn't know you'd survive. I didn't know this would become real. I didn't know your life would require me to revise myself. I didn't know I could be this wrong and still have to stand in public clothes afterward. I asked, which part? He looked at the floor, then said, any of it? That was almost enough to hurt. Instead, it mostly tired me. Because late truth still leaves you carrying the years it didn't arrive. My mother never apologized that night. Of course she didn't. Women like her do not apologize at events where photographers are present and social ecosystems remain in play. She simply became softer around the edges for the rest of the evening, which in my family counted as the emotional equivalent of lowering a weapon to knee height. Natalie spoke to me one more time before I left. The party was winding down. The quartet had stopped. Staff were moving into ghost mode. Candles burning lower. The room smelled like champagne, garden roses, and expensive fatigue. She stood by the side terrace doors and said, quietly, you didn't have to do this like this. That line mattered. Not because it was strong, because it admitted the shape of the room. Not that I had helped, that I had helped in a way she could not dominate. I looked at her, then out at the water, and said, no, you did. That was the truest thing available. Because everything about that night had been built on a foundation she helped pour years earlier in that hallway mirror when she taught me exactly what role I occupied in the family and what kind of woman she believed I would never become. I left before the last guests. Came home to pizza boxes. Noah half asleep on the couch. And Eli insisting on hearing whether the rich people had really cried during speeches. Yes. I told him. Why? Because everybody cries at parties when enough money is involved. I said. He laughed so hard, soda came out of his nose. That, honestly, healed more than any apology could have. The aftermath was slow. More honest than warm. My father called more. My mother wrote one long letter 6 weeks later in cream stationery with beautiful handwriting and exactly the sort of restrained wording that would have made an outsider think she had done the brave thing. It was full of words like pressure, fear, expectations, wanting to protect me, and not understanding at the time what I was capable of. I read it in my office with a cup of tea going cold beside me and thought, for the first time in my life, not about whether I should forgive her, but about what level of access she had earned to the version of me she now wanted. That was real growth. Not magnanimity. Standards. I replied with 3 sentences. You were not protecting me. You were protecting your ranking system. Any future relationship we have starts there. She did not answer for a month. Then she called. Not to argue. Not to rewrite. Just to ask whether Eli wanted to spend an afternoon with her at the aquarium. That may not sound like much. In my family, it was seismic. Because it bypassed Image, bypassed Natalie, bypassed me. Avon. It was the first request my mother had ever made that sounded like relationship instead of management. I said yes. Carefully. Not because she had earned absolution. Because Eli deserved the chance to know adults as they became. Not only as they failed me before he existed. Natalie took longer. She always will. She sent a thank you note 2 weeks after the engagement party. Actual stationery. Actual stamp. 3 lines. Beautifully phrased. Emotionally thin. Still. 1 sentence mattered. I misjudged what strength would look like in your life. There it was. Not enough. Real enough. That's the thing nobody tells you about family vindication. It rarely arrives in the language you wanted at 19. It arrives in reduced tones. Partielle concession. Small structural shifts. And the slow recognition that the people who misread you are now forced to do it with evidence in the room. My son is 11 now. My company runs multi-city events. Noah still asks the only questions that matter when I start turning pain into story too quickly. Connor finally got a decent therapist and became almost suspiciously pleasant. My father watches Eli at baseball games with the odd reverence men develop around grandsons when they realize far too late how badly they rationed possibility among their own children. And me? I am no one's cautionary tale. That is the real ending. Not the venue. Not Natalie's face. Not my mother's pearls turning cold under her own hand, while she realized the room's axis had changed. The ending is that the label failed. My sister called me the family failure after I got pregnant at 19. 9 years later, she froze when I walked into her engagement party as the woman funding the venue. People hear that sentence and think the revenge was the money. It wasn't. Money was just the language my family finally respected enough to hear what I had been saying all along. The revenge was competence. The revenge was survival without apology. The revenge was building a life so structurally undeniable that the people who once used your hardest season to define you have to stand inside the rooms you create and behave better because they know everyone else can now see the old ranking system for what it was. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are more of us than anyone admits. Young women whose first crisis got turned into family mythology. Daughters who were not exiled, just downgraded. Sisters who learned too early that pretty cruelty in a quiet voice still changes the weather of a whole life. And if that's you, remember this. You do not owe the people who named you at your weakest. The final definition. Sometimes the strongest ending is simple. They called you the consequence. Then, one day they walked into a room you built and realized the future had stopped using their vocabulary.